Good evening and welcome back to Whispers at Night. Tonight we journey deep into Alaska's wild frontier with 10 of the most unsettling true horror stories from the last frontier. These harrowing experiences come directly from ice road truckers, bush pilots, oil rig workers, and wilderness professionals who encountered phenomena that defy explanation in America's harshest and most remote landscapes. From the icy expanse of the Bering Sea to the relentless darkness of Arctic winters, each story is a verified encounter supported by multiple witnesses and evidence. These are no legends or ghost stories, but real accounts that forever altered the lives of those who faced them in the land of the midnight sun. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Whispers at Night for daily true horror tales exploring the darkest corners of human experience. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we uncover the eerie mysteries lurking just beyond civilization's reach. Now brace yourself and step into the brutal beauty of Alaska, where the cold is deadly and something far more terrifying hides in the shadows. My name is Jordan Hayes, and I'm a marine biologist. 3 years ago, I was 26 and thought I knew the ocean better than most people know their own neighborhoods. I had spent countless hours studying Arctic marine ecosystems, poring over data and field reports, but I had never actually worked alone on the Bering Sea ice sheet during the heart of winter. When the opportunity arose to conduct ice thickness measurements for a climate research project, I jumped at it. I thought it would be the perfect chance to advance my career and contribute to something meaningful. I was wrong about so many things. The research station was little more than a prefabricated hut sitting atop 20 feet of solid ice, roughly 40 miles from the nearest land. It was February, which meant living in near complete darkness most of the day, with only a few hours of dim twilight to break the monotony. At first, the isolation didn't bother me. I had my equipment, my protocols for data collection, and enough supplies to last 6 weeks. The plan was simple. Take daily measurements of ice thickness using ground-penetrating radar, collect water samples from the holes I drilled, and document any changes in the ice structure. Standard work I had done dozens of times before, just never alone, and never in conditions this extreme. The first week went smoothly. I established a routine: wake up, check the weather instruments, take measurements, record data, eat, read, sleep. The ice was stable, averaging about 18 feet thick, and all my instruments were functioning perfectly. The only sounds were the wind howling across the ice and the occasional crack as the frozen surface shifted under thermal stress. These were normal sounds, expected sounds. I had read about them in countless papers. I knew they were just the ice responding to temperature changes and pressure from the moving sea beneath. But during the second week, I started noticing something else. At first, I thought the wind was creating unusual echoes in the ice formations around the station. It sounded like whispers, faint, almost like static from a radio tuned between stations. The sounds only came at night. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, lying in my sleeping bag and trying to rest, I would hear soft, indistinct murmurs coming from somewhere beneath me. Being a scientist, my first instinct was to find a rational explanation. I checked all my instruments for interference, thinking maybe one was picking up distant radio chatter from ships or aircraft. But everything was functioning normally, and the sounds weren't coming through any electronics. They were coming directly through the ice itself, as if the frozen surface conducted voices from far below. I started keeping detailed logs: when I heard them, how long they lasted, and any patterns I could identify. By the 3rd week, the voices were becoming clearer. I could distinguish different speakers, though I couldn't understand their language. It wasn't English, and it didn't sound like any of the indigenous languages I'd heard during my brief time in Alaska. The rhythm was wrong, the cadence unnatural. Sometimes it sounded like a conversation between 2 people, other times like a group discussion or meeting. What disturbed me most was that the voices seemed to be moving closer to the surface, growing louder each night. I drilled deeper holes to locate the source, My standard equipment could penetrate about 15 feet, but the sounds seemed to originate far below that. Placing my ear directly on the ice, the voices were clear, as if I were listening to people in a room next door through a thin wall. I could hear individual words now, though I still couldn't understand them. The conversation sounded urgent, almost heated, as if the speakers were debating something of great importance. Sleep became impossible. The voices recurred every night, starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. They were so distinct that I began to recognize individual speakers by vocal patterns. One voice, deeper than the rest, seemed to be asking questions or giving instructions. Another, higher pitched, responded with protests or disagreements. Occasionally, a third voice interjected short comments, silencing the others for minutes at a time. By the fourth week, I convinced myself that perhaps people were trapped beneath the ice, maybe survivors of a shipwreck who somehow found air pockets and were trying to communicate. The explanation seemed plausible, even though I knew survival under such conditions for months was impossible. Driven by a need to help, I drilled multiple holes, shouting into the ice in hopes of creating a communication point. Yet, whenever I attempted contact, the voices immediately stopped, resuming only the next night. Rational thought told me it was impossible. The ice was too thick and solid to contain any cavity large enough to sustain life. Yet the voices were real. I recorded them nightly. Playback confirmed that the conversations were distinct and consistent. They weren't hallucinations or psychosis. They were human voices speaking a language I couldn't identify. During the fifth week, a terrifying change occurred. The voices began including words I recognized. Not English words exactly, but terms that somehow conveyed meaning. I started understanding fragments of their discussion, and what I learned terrified me. They were talking about me. They knew I was listening. They knew I was alone, above them on the ice. They described my daily routines, my equipment, even details of my personal life that no one else in Alaska could know. They mentioned my apartment back in Seattle, my research projects, and arguments I'd had with my advisor before leaving. They even discussed my sister, and that she was getting married in June. How could voices beneath 20 feet of ice know such intimate details? My logical explanations collapsed. These weren't survivors or radio transmissions. These were something else. The final week was a nightmare. Sleep vanished and paranoia intensified. The voices now spoke directly to me, still in their strange language, yet I understood perfectly. It was as if meaning was transmitted straight into my mind rather than through sound. They revealed truths about the ocean absent from scientific literature, describing deep Arctic phenomena that human researchers would only discover decades later. They spoke of the ice as a living entity, growing and spreading across the Arctic for purposes incomprehensible to human science. On my last night, the voices made an offer. They invited me to join them beneath the ice, to learn secrets of the ocean no surface-dwelling human had ever known. All I had to do was drill one deeper hole and step into it. They promised survival and a transformation into something greater than individual human consciousness. For a brief, surreal moment, I considered it. The isolation, the constant voices, and the awareness of being in the presence of something beyond normal human experience made the offer tempting. But as dawn approached, rational thought returned. I packed my equipment and called for an emergency pickup. 6 hours later, a helicopter arrived, and seeing another human being felt like a miracle. I told them I'd finished my research early and needed to return due to equipment issues. They didn't question it. I still have the recordings. Hours of voices in a language that doesn't exist, discussing impossible knowledge. Linguists, acoustics experts, and marine biologists have all listened. No one can explain them. The official report covered ice thickness data and water samples, omitting the voices entirely. I completed my degree and now work in warmer waters, studying coral reefs and tropical ecosystems. Yet sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. Not as clearly as on the ice, but just at the edge of perception. They still talk about me, following my life and actions. And sometimes I find myself listening for that deeper voice, the one that made the offer. Part of me, the part that faced something impossible in the Arctic darkness, still wonders what I might have learned if I had accepted. My name is Jake Sullivan, but everyone who knows me just calls me Bear. For over 15 years now, I've been driving the ice roads of Alaska, those frozen highways that thread through some of the wildest, most unforgiving terrain on the continent. This job isn't just truck driving, it's a constant battle for survival. Every mile is a test against nature's harshest forces. One simple mistake, one flicker of distraction, a tiny mechanical failure, can mean the difference between coming home to loved ones or becoming a cold statistic buried beneath countless tons of ice and snow. I started this career when I was 29, freshly divorced and desperate to leave my old life behind in Denver, Colorado. The city had been a cage of memories I wanted to shed. Alaska promised a clean slate. The ice road companies were always recruiting drivers willing to brave the dangers of delivering vital supplies to the most remote locations during the brutal winter months. The pay was good, but the deadly risks, they rarely mentioned those. During my first year, I witnessed 3 tragic accidents. Drivers with far more experience than me, swallowed up by the merciless cold. The Dalton Highway, also called the Hall Road, stretches over 400 miles through the savage wilderness of Alaska. In winter, temperatures regularly hit 40 below zero. That's before the wind chill drags it down even further, sometimes to 60 or 70 below. The road itself is a perilous sheet of ice over gravel, winding through mountain passes, frozen rivers, and alongside cliffs plunging thousands of feet into rocky gorges, where rescuers rarely arrive in time. Yet despite the deadly isolation, there's a strange kind of purity out here. No traffic lights, no city noise, no distractions, just the drone of a diesel engine, the crunch of tires on packed snow, and the vast white landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. That connection with raw nature is what kept me coming back every year. At least, that's how I saw it, until the night that changed everything. It was late November, near the start of last winter. I was on my 3rd run of the season heading north toward Prudhoe Bay. The forecast had warned of heavy snow, but after years on the road, I thought I could handle it. I was hauling a full load of propane tanks for a remote drilling operation outside of the Arctic Ocean. The cargo was valuable, delivery deadlines tight, and the bonus for on-time arrival hefty enough to justify the risk. I left Fairbanks just after midnight, anticipating less traffic on the ice roads overnight. The first few hours were routine. Snow fell steadily but lightly. Road conditions were what I expected for late November. My CB radio shared the usual chatter, weather updates, road reports, and the rough jokes truckers use to pass time on long hauls. By the time I crossed the Yukon River, the weather had taken a dangerous turn. What had been light snowflakes was now a full whiteout. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet ahead of my headlights. The wind whipped snow into swirling vortexes, warping my sense of direction despite having driven this road hundreds of times. I'd been driving about 6 hours when I first caught sight of him. At first I thought fatigue was playing tricks on me after hours of battling the storm, but no. There was definitely someone standing by the roadside. A silhouette with thumb raised, the classic hitchhiker sign. Now, anyone with experience knows you don't pick up hitchhikers on these ice roads. It's far too risky. Wildlife danger, liability, and the simple fact that anyone venturing out on foot in this weather is probably not stable or sane. Still, something about this figure didn't sit right. He wore a thin jacket, no hat, no gloves whatsoever. At these temperatures, most people wouldn't last minutes outside, let alone standing there like that. Yet he seemed impervious to the freezing cold that was already seeping through my heated cab. Against better judgment, I slowed down, maybe driven by some ingrained human instinct to help, or sheer curiosity about who could survive out here so ill-equipped. I stopped my rig about 10 feet beyond him and waited. He walked up to the passenger side door slowly, his steps deliberate and eerily calm, unnatural in a place that demands urgency to stay alive. When he reached my window, he knocked twice, soft but distinct above the roaring wind. I cracked open the window. "Where are you headed?" I shouted against the storm's howl. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond my reach. When he finally answered, his voice was almost disconcertingly steady. No fatigue, no cold, just a flat single word. North. That should have been my first real warning. No one out here in deadly conditions gives you such a vague reply when asking for help. But the storm was worsening quickly, and every second with the window open was draining heat from the cab. I made a decision I've regretted ever since. "Get in," I told him. He climbed into the passenger seat with a fluid smoothness that didn't feel right, too graceful for someone who should have been freezing. The moment I got a good look in the cab lights, a chill ran right through me. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, and his eyes were a washed-out blue, empty and soulless, like frozen pools reflecting nothing alive. But it wasn't just his appearance. His presence sucked the warmth from the cab, thickening the air into a heavy, suffocating blanket, like the quiet before a storm breaks. I tried to make small talk, asking where he'd come from, how long he'd been out there, if he was all right. Nothing. He just stared straight ahead, expressionless, blank. Sometimes he'd slowly turn his head and meet my eyes with those chilling pale blues, as if he was studying me, really studying me, in a way that made my skin crawl. Hours passed, and the storm grew worse still. The CB's usual chatter faded, replaced by complete silence. The storm seemed to swallow the radio waves whole. No static, no voices. The isolation felt complete, and with that silent passenger beside me, the cab felt like a trap tightening around my lungs. Near the Arctic Circle marker, things took a turn into the truly unreal. The man, silent all this time, suddenly broke the quiet. "You are not safe here." His voice was hollow, echoing like it came from a great distance. The words hit me harder than the bitter cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to steady my voice despite the gnawing dread filling my chest. Instead of answering, he raised a pale hand and pointed out the passenger window. I turned to look and slammed on the brakes, heart pounding like a war drum. There, moving through the tree line parallel to the road, were dark shapes that shouldn't be there. Too large to be wolves or bears, moving with a deliberate, calculated purpose, not the scatter of animal instinct. One broke from the shadows and darted across the road in front of my headlights. I caught only a glimpse of it. A figure almost human but distorted, wrong in ways my mind couldn't accept. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, whirling to look at the seat beside me, only to find it empty. No impression in the cushion, no warmth, no hint anyone had ever been there at all. Alone in the cab, alone on that bleak, frozen road, I pressed the accelerator and fled as fast as the icy surface would allow. My hands trembled uncontrollably, barely gripping the steering wheel. For hours, 2 full hours, I drove in a state of controlled panic, constantly checking my mirrors, eyes darting to every flicker of shadow that played on the edges of my headlights. Eventually, I reached the safety of the truck stop at Dead Horse. I stayed inside my cab long after shutting down, trying to pull my fractured mind together. I told myself what I'd seen must have been a hallucination. Exhaustion and the relentless storm twisting my senses. But deep inside, I knew what I'd experienced was terrifyingly real. Since that night, I've encountered the pale-eyed hitchhiker 3 more times. Always in fierce storms, always when the world fades into white oblivion. Each time, he appears at the roadside, climbs silently into my cab, sits without a word for hours, then vanishes, just before something explainable happens. Other drivers I've met tell similar stories. A ghostly figure with translucent skin and empty blue eyes, an unshakable presence that chills the soul. I still drive these ice roads. It's the life I chose, and Alaska feels like home now. But I never pick up hitchhikers anymore, no matter how desperate or lost they look. Some roads aren't just highways. They're gateways to places better left unopened. and some passengers aren't headed for any earthly destination. So if you find yourself behind the wheel on the Dalton Highway in winter, and you spot a pale-eyed man standing there in the storm, don't stop. Keep driving. Don't glance in the rear view, just trust me. Some help costs too much. Some mysteries belong buried beneath the ice and snow, forever untouched. My name is Tommy Kowalski, and I have spent the last 18 years working in the oil fields of Alaska. I am what most people would call a roughneck, a blue-collar guy who gets his hands dirty performing the back-breaking work that keeps America's energy flowing. The work is not for the faint of heart. I have drilled through permafrost, battled equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures, and worked shifts that would exhaust men half my age. I take pride in being tough, reliable, and fearless when it comes to getting the job done, no matter what obstacles stand in my way. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, I learned early that nothing comes without effort. My father worked in the auto plants until the jobs were shipped overseas. He taught me that a real man provides for his family by doing whatever honest work is necessary, no matter how difficult or exhausting it might be. When I was 22, struggling to make ends meet with a pregnant wife and mounting bills, I heard about the high wages in Alaska's oil fields. I packed up everything I owned, kissed my wife goodbye, and headed north to Prudhoe Bay to make a fortune in one of the harshest industrial environments on Earth. From the first day, the work was brutal. 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero, handling equipment that could crush or burn you in an instant if one mistake was made, and living in company barracks surrounded by nothing but frozen tundra stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. The days were relentless, but I adapted quickly, kept my mouth shut, followed orders, and earned a reputation as someone who could be counted on in dangerous situations. Over the years, I worked my way up from the bottom of the crew hierarchy to become a senior drilling technician. I became responsible for operating and maintaining some of the most sophisticated and expensive equipment in oil extraction. I trained newcomers in safety procedures, supervised younger workers, and prided myself on being trusted by management with operations critical to the company's success. Prudhoe Bay oil field is like a small city in the middle of nowhere. Hundreds of workers live and work in conditions that most people would find impossible. We had our own power plant, water treatment facility, dining halls, recreation centers, and even a small medical clinic staffed with doctors specializing in industrial injuries. Operations never stopped. Work continued 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of the weather or mechanical issues. Despite all the training, protective gear, and decades of experience accumulated by workers, there are dangers that no preparation can fully address. Some risks exist far outside the realm of normal industrial hazards, so rare and strange that they do not appear in safety manuals or emergency protocols. The incident that changed everything occurred during a routine deep drilling operation in late March of last year. We were extending an existing well to reach newly discovered oil deposits nearly 3,000 feet below the established extraction level. Geological surveys indicated substantial reserves, and the company was eager to tap into what could be millions of barrels of high-quality crude. I was supervising the night shift crew of 8 experienced workers, all with an average of 12 years in the field. We had been drilling steadily for 6 days, making excellent progress through rock and permafrost layers, undisturbed for thousands of years. Everything was proceeding according to plan, with no indication of what lay beneath, waiting to be unearthed. At approximately 2:30 a.m., as we prepared to advance the drill through a particularly dense rock layer, the entire drilling apparatus lurched violently. The first assumption was geological instability, or a pressurized gas pocket causing resistance, but the monitoring equipment showed nothing unusual, no warnings, no pressure anomalies, no faults. Within minutes, a thick black substance began seeping up through the drill shaft, spreading across the platform floor. Initially, we assumed it was crude oil surfacing early, a potential jackpot for the company. Some crew members cheered, thinking we had struck a particularly rich deposit that would yield significant bonuses. But as the substance flowed, it became clear it was unlike any crude oil we had ever seen. Its consistency was wrong, viscous and thick like liquid tar, with a shifting oily sheen that seemed almost alive. The smell was far worse than any petroleum odor, putrid, a mix of rotting organic matter with a chemical sharpness that burned nostrils and made eyes water. The first real indication we were dealing with something dangerous came when a young worker, Danny Martinez, accidentally stepped into the substance. He screamed and clawed at his boot as the black material began eating through the thick rubber sole at an alarming speed. We managed to remove the boot before it reached his foot, but the rubber and even steel reinforcements were corroded, leaving us horrified. This was no ordinary oil. Its corrosive properties exceeded anything in our hazardous materials training. I ordered an immediate evacuation and called for emergency response teams. But before anyone could retreat, the situation worsened. The black substance began spreading rapidly, moving uphill against gravity and acting almost as if it had intent. Tentacle-like streams reached toward workers, seeking contact with skin or clothing. When a smow, all amounts splashed onto the hand of veteran driller Frank Kowalski, no relation despite the surname. His hand turned a sickly grey-black almost instantly. His expression changed completely. His eyes went blank, unfocused. He walked deliberately toward the black substance with jerky, unnatural movements, as if controlled by some invisible puppeteer. The emergency alarms blared, and more personnel arrived. But the black substance seemed to react aggressively to human presence, spreading faster and targeting anyone remaining on the platform. Within 30 minutes, 6 crew members had been exposed, transforming into entities barely resembling their former selves. They moved in perfect coordination, following what seemed like a shared consciousness connected to the black material. They ignored calls, verbal commands, or attempts to restrain them, driven by a single purpose: spread the contamination to others. They tried to smear the substance onto exposed skin, force it into mouths and noses, leaving me and the remaining crew in terror. As the situation escalated, facility management sealed the drilling area and initiated quarantine procedures. Those not yet exposed were evacuated, and hazardous materials teams attempted containment. Every effort failed. Chemical neutralizers had no effect. Protective barriers were powerless. Worse, the infected seemed to gain coordination and strength, adapting to every defensive measure we tried. The nightmare peaked when the infected workers began sabotaging the facility. Using intimate knowledge of operations, they disabled fire suppression systems, tampered with power distribution, and attempted to breach containment areas. I escaped only by leaving some co-workers behind, their pleas haunting me still. Staying meant certain death. Leaving was the only chance to warn others about what we had unleashed. The official report classified the incident as an industrial accident caused by equipment failure and toxic material exposure. Media reports blamed a drill bit malfunction releasing hydrogen sulfide gas, resulting in casualties and temporary shutdown. Families received death benefits and signed agreements preventing disclosure. But I know the truth. Beneath Alaska's frozen ground lie ancient forces, sealed away for millions of years. Our drilling operations are mere pinpricks, occasionally breaching the barriers that keep these entities contained. I no longer work in the oil fields. I moved back to the lower 48 and found construction work that keeps me safely above ground. But late at night, I wake thinking about those men consumed by the black substance. I wonder if somewhere beneath the Alaskan permafrost, they still wait, biding their time, ready for the next group of workers to drill too deep. Some things should remain buried forever. Some energy sources are far too dangerous, no matter the potential value. Even after all these years, I feel the cold grip of the fear I experienced that night. Every sound in my new workplace echoes with possibilities I would rather not imagine. The memory of Frank, of Danny, and the others lost to the black substance is a constant reminder. Beneath the ice, beneath the rock, something ancient watches. Waiting. Patient. And no amount of human preparation can stop it once it awakens. The oil fields of Alaska are more than frozen wastelands. They are gateways to something far older, something we were never meant to disturb. I tell this story only to those who will understand and take it seriously. The black substance, whatever it is not just a chemical anomaly. It is alive in ways we cannot comprehend. It thinks, it reacts, and it spreads. My colleagues who perished may still exist somewhere in its control, their human selves trapped beneath a creeping darkness that grows beneath our feet. And every time someone drills too deep, I fear the same fate will repeat. This knowledge keeps me vigilant, keeps me wary, and serves as a warning to anyone daring enough to venture into those frozen depths. Respect the land, respect the ground beneath it, and never underestimate what lies hidden beneath Alaska's ice. Some forces, once disturbed, cannot be undone, and some things are far too dangerous to awaken, no matter how tempting the rewards might be. My name is Dr. Evelyn Carter, and for as long as I can remember, I have been drawn to the wilderness and its most elusive inhabitants. I am a wildlife biologist by training, specializing in large mammal ecology, with a focus on predator-prey dynamics in northern ecosystems. For the past 10 years, my life has been devoted to the study of these creatures across the frozen reaches of Alaska. I earned my doctorate at Colorado State University, my dissertation rooted in years of research on caribou, wolves, and the delicate balance of survival in Arctic habitats. Most of my professional work takes place in Denali National Park, a vast and awe-inspiring expanse of mountain ranges, glacial valleys, and unbroken forest. It is a place where time seems to stretch and contract, where every ridge and valley holds echoes of both natural wonder and something far more ancient. My faith has always been placed in science, logic, data, rigorous observation, and cautious analysis. Yet I have learned, painfully and irrevocably, that even science falters when confronted with the deep shadows that linger in the last frontiers of the world. Our team had been preparing for this expedition for months. The plan was straightforward. An extended field study nearly 40 miles into the backcountry, well beyond the reach of tourists or most ranger patrols. Our goal was to document changes in seasonal migration routes of caribou, movements seemingly altered by unusual vegetation shifts linked to recent warming trends. We secured the necessary permits, gathered funding, and assembled every piece of modern equipment we could afford: GPS collars, motion-triggered cameras, drones, soil sensors, weeks' worth of supplies, and enough survival gear to endure 3 weeks in total isolation. The expedition crew consisted of 4 carefully chosen individuals. I served as project leader. Alongside me was Dr. Adrian Cole, a carnivore behavior specialist whose research had earned him a reputation as both brilliant and stubborn. We also brought Maya Patel, an eager graduate student from the University of Alaska, Anchorage, pursuing her thesis on predator displacement in tundra ecosystems. And lastly, there was Daniel Crow, our guide, an experienced tracker and former ranger whose knowledge of Denali's hidden trails was unmatched. His presence was not just useful, it was essential. The first few days unfolded like a dream. Skies were crystalline, the air crisp but mild for the season. The tundra seemed alive in every direction, the sharp cries of migratory birds overhead, the faint rustling of hares darting through underbrush, the distant bugle of a moose calling from the river valley. Each morning we trekked out in measured lines, surveying our transects, collecting vegetation samples, and carefully logging every detail. We set up cameras along narrow game trails, fitted tracking collars onto several caribou, and returned each night to camp, feeling accomplished. Surrounded by raw, untamed beauty, we felt humbled, but also invigorated. Yet, routine never lasts long in the wild. The shift came suddenly, without warning. On the 4th day, as we moved toward a river crossing favored by caribou and moose, the wilderness itself seemed to change its character. At first it was subtle. The air grew unnaturally heavy, clinging to our skin with a weight that was more oppressive than physical. A creeping fog began to roll in from the south, curling low along the valleys until it coiled around the trees like a living thing. The once vibrant forest, alive with chatter and motion, became eerily still. No birds called, no insects hummed. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. I felt it first in my chest, a mounting pressure, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Our visibility dropped to a mere handful of feet, the fog thickening with each step. Suddenly, Daniel raised his hand in a sharp signal to halt. His usual calm demeanor had given way to tension. His jaw clenched, his eyes scanned the indistinct tree line with the precision of a man who knew the wilderness better than most people know their homes. "I don't like this," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, yet its urgency carried. "We're not alone out here." A chill spread across my spine. My hand instinctively tightened around the rifle slung at my side, and then it came. The sound. From somewhere deep within the fog-drenched forest, a low guttural growl rose and vibrated through the very ground beneath us. It was not the call of any predator I had studied in my career. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf. The sound was deeper, more resonant, and it carried an unmistakable quality: ancient hatred. Fear clawed at the edges of my rational mind. Adrian quickly took the rifle from me, his body tensing as his instincts took over. We formed a tight defensive circle, our backs nearly touching, our eyes straining to pierce the shifting fog. Every shadow became a threat, every rustle a warning. And then we saw it. Through the swirling mist, a form emerged. Half seen, distorted, yet undeniable. It moved with an uncanny fluidity that no natural creature possessed. Its body was cloaked in tangled, matted fur, its limbs bent at impossible angles, violating every principle of mammalian anatomy I knew. But it was the eyes that froze me. They glowed, not reflecting light like a wolf's or a bear's, but radiating their own unnatural luminescence. And behind that glow was intelligence, sharp and malevolent. For the next hour, its presence stalked us. Branches cracked in the dist. Ants. Low, unearthly howls echoed across the forest, some near, some far, suggesting more than one entity. Daniel urged us to retreat toward a rocky outcropping near the river, where the high ground offered some advantage. We obeyed, our movements slow and deliberate, our fear growing with every sound that pursued us. At the outcropping, we lit a fire, our only defense against the pressing dark. Yet the night offered no peace. Sleep was impossible. Each flicker of flame threw shadows that twisted and writhed, appearing to move independently from the fire itself. Maya clutched her notebook against her chest, whispering broken prayers into the night. Adrian sat unmoving, rifle across his lap, eyes locked on the tree line. Daniel paced the perimeter endlessly, whispering to himself as though trying to convince his nerves to hold. When dawn came, it brought no relief. What we found instead chilled us deeper than the night. Our equipment, the expensive remote cameras, had been smashed, their casings bent and twisted. GPS collars were torn apart, their circuitry strewn like confetti across the underbrush. Yet no animal carcasses, no blood, no tracks. Just deliberate destruction. It was a message, one none of us could deny. We weren't merely being watched, we were being targeted. Despite everything, the drive to gather data pushed us onward. Daniel reluctantly guided us toward a set of caves he had marked on older maps, places avoided by most, steeped in indigenous lore. The local Athabascans, he explained quietly, spoke of these caves as resting places, boundaries that should not be crossed. The largest cavern yawned before us, like the open jaws of some vast creature. Inside, the air was fetid, heavy with the stench of decay. Bones littered the floor, scattered across the stone in tangled heaps. Some animal, some unmistakably human. Their ages varied, some long turned to dust, others disturbingly fresh. The cave walls seemed to whisper. At first I thought it was wind, but soon the sound became clearer, indistinct words curling in the air, carrying with them a weight of malice. Every step inside felt like trespassing across a threshold into something wholly unnatural. That was when Maya screamed. The sound tore through the cavern, high-pitched and primal. We turned instantly, but she was gone, simply gone. One moment she stood clutching her notebook, and the next she had vanished. We scoured the cavern and forest for hours, calling her name until our throats ached. No footprints, no broken branches, no trace of her at all. It was as though she had been erased. The silence afterward was suffocating. That night, none of us spoke. I felt eyes on me constantly, from the trees, from the rocks, from the very shadows themselves. My mind played cruel tricks, shapes shifting at the edge of vision, ghostly figures slipping between the trunks. I was losing my grip on the boundaries of reality. Daniel, grim and weary, finally spoke of the old legends. The Wendigo, a spirit born of hunger and madness, cursed to stalk the wilderness in endless hunger. I had once dismissed such stories as folklore, but now, with Maya gone and the forest alive with nightmares, I felt the foundations of my science crumbling. The next morning, Adrian disappeared. He had gone to check our equipment. His final radio transmission came through in broken static, but the last words were unmistakable. It knows us. It is coming. Then, silence. Panic consumed me. I gathered what I could carry, desperate to retrace our route back to safety. But the paths had changed. Trails we had marked were gone. Clearings twisted into thickets overnight. It was as though the wilderness itself had shifted, trapping me within its cursed geography. My flight back towards civilization was a blur of terror. Always I felt them, just beyond sight, always watching, always following. By the time I stumbled into the ranger station, I was unrecognizable even to myself. My body was weak, my spirit fractured, my rational mind haunted by the impossible. Since that day, my work has never been the same. I still pursue science, but I also seek answers that lie beyond it, answers hidden in legends, whispered in shadows, carved into the bones of the earth. Some truths are not meant to be uncovered. Some places are not meant to be disturbed. And yet, I cannot escape. Every night, the glowing eyes follow me in dreams. Every whisper of wind carries their voices. I share this story now as both record and warning. If you ever find yourself in the wild heart of Alaska, remember this. The land is older than us, and it remembers. Tread carefully. Respect the legends, because the unseen eyes that watch from the darkness, they never blink. My name is Logan Mercer, and I've been fishing the Aleutian waters for over 32 years. I started when I was 20, working deck on other men's boats, learning the trade from captains who had been pulling king crab and halibut from these waters since before Alaska became a state. By the time I was 35, I had my own vessel, a 60-foot steel-hulled boat I named Sea Warden after my late wife's favorite hymn. For 17 years, that boat had been my livelihood, my home, and my sanctuary. She braved every storm the Bering Sea could throw at us, guided me through ice floes that would have crushed lesser vessels, and never let me down, until November 2019, when something in those waters decided to test both our limits. The fishing had been solid that season. We had a crew of 5, pulling in a decent haul of pollock and king crab despite late-season storms battering the area for weeks. The Weather Service kept warning of a massive low-pressure system moving in from the northwest, but we'd weathered worse, and the fish were plentiful. You don't abandon a good catch because of a forecast. That's not how you make a living in these waters. We estimated we had roughly 18 hours before the storm hit, enough to haul the remaining pots and head to Dutch Harbor to wait it out. That final morning began like any other. Seas were running 8 to 10 feet. typical for November in the Aleutians. Visibility was fair, maybe 3 miles in the dim grey light that passes for dawn. 12 pots remained, scattered across roughly 4 square miles of fishing ground that I'd been working for nearly 15 years. I knew every rock, every depth shift, every current in that area. My sonar painted the bottom like a detailed map, revealing ridges and valleys where crab liked to gather. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The first sign that something was wrong came when we hauled the 6th pot. Tommy, my deck, K-Boss called out that it was heavier than normal. These were 700-pound steel crab pots, and when full, they might weigh close to a ton. But this pot felt like twice that. When it broke the surface, we understood why. It was completely encrusted in marine growth unlike anything I had ever seen. Thick, rope-like strands that resembled seaweed, but deep crimson instead of brown or green. The growth clung to every bar of the pot, obscuring the crab inside. We tried shaking it off, but it held fast, almost as if glued. When Danny, my youngest crew member, reached out to pull some away by hand, I stopped him. There was something wrong with the way it moved. Unnatural. It didn't flow with the current like normal seaweed. It wriggled, almost as if trying to reach for the boat. We ended up cutting most of it with knives. Inside the pot, we found something disturbing. The crab were there, but all dead. And they'd been dead a long time. Not the kind of death caused by lack of water, but something else. Their shells looked drained, as though moisture had been sucked out. The next 3 pots yielded the same results: thick, red growth and lifeless crab. By the 10th pot, the growth was so dense we struggled to lift it. The hydraulic winch strained, the engine labored harder than normal, and the boat leaned slightly to starboard under the weight. That's when Marcus, my engineer, came up from below, pale and tense. He said the sonar was acting strangely, showing shapes on the bottom that hadn't been there before, large masses moving beneath us. I looked at the sonar display myself. What I saw defied explanation. The familiar rocky bottom was gone, replaced by massive shapes clustered beneath our boat. They were enormous, some the size of school buses, and they were moving. One detached itself from the group, rising rapidly toward us. Depth sounders showed speeds far beyond any fish or marine mammal. I instructed the crew to secure everything and move, but before we could, something struck us from below. Not a hard collision, but a massive, soft bump against the hull. It was strong enough to knock Tommy off his feet, yet made no sound of metal striking metal. It felt alive, organic. Hull-mounted sonar confirmed the presence. A massive entity pressed against the bottom, extending at least 30 feet along the keel. That's when things became truly bizarre. The radio began picking up sounds. Not voices, not marine chatter, but long, low musical tones, harmonizing in patterns that were unnatural, neither mechanical nor fully organic. They seemed to come from multiple directions, surrounding us. Attempts to call the Coast Guard on emergency frequencies failed entirely. The tones overwhelmed the transmission. The entity remained for nearly an hour, shifting occasionally, but never leaving. During that time, more shapes appeared on sonar, moving into positions around our boat, at least a dozen massive forms, all coordinated. The red growth that had covered our pots started rising from the depths, forming thick mats around us, gradually enclosing the boat. Marcus emerged from the engine room, visibly shaken, claiming propulsion was impossible. The propeller spun normally, but the water felt as thick as molasses. We were trapped in a circle of red growth, surrounded by entities our eyes couldn't see, but sonar detected. Then the temperature dropped. Not just the air, but the water itself. Ice formed on the rigging, but unlike key normal ice, it was tinted deep red, appearing in strange patterned formations. Within 20 minutes, the sea warden was coated in this red ice, the added weight lowering her into the water. I realized we were being pulled down, not rapidly, but deliberately. Water was rising along the hull, and no amount of pumping could stop it. The vessel wasn't breached, The water was forced up through the build system. Whatever was below wasn't just holding us, it was trying to drag us under. I made the decision to abandon ship. We launched our life raft just as the red ice reached the wheelhouse windows. The sea warden sank slowly, almost gently, as if carefully lowered rather than destroyed. As she disappeared beneath the surface, the musical tones grew louder, more intricate, almost celebratory, as if the creatures were communicating. The red growth dispersed, and sonar-detected shapes moved away in different directions. 6 hours later, a Coast Guard cutter arrived, responding to our emergency beacon. By then, there was no trace of the sea warden, no debris, no oil slick, nothing. The water temperature was normal, and no unusual growth remained. Sonar revealed only the familiar rocky bottom. The official report blamed catastrophic structural failure due to storm conditions, despite the weather improving when we sank. The insurance company paid without question, but I know the truth. Something in those waters took my boat, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I haven't returned to fishing. I sold my permits, moved to Anchorage, and now work in airport security. Steady indoor work keeps me on dry land. Yet sometimes, lying in bed at night, I still hear those musical tones. Not as clearly as back then, but they're there, calling from somewhere below. And I wonder if the sea warden is still down there too, trapped in some underwater realm where normal rules don't lie, with those entities still communicating about what they discovered that November day. My name is Captain Daniel Hayes, and I come from a long bloodline of men who have braved the merciless waters of Alaska, carving out their survival against an ocean that has never truly belonged to mankind. My grandfather, Leonard Hayes, laid the foundation of this family legacy back in 1950, when he bought a small fishing boat with his savings from working the canneries. My father, Richard Hayes, carried the legacy forward, building the business into something sturdier, and handed down not only the vessel, but also a code of respect for the sea, a lesson etched into me since childhood. The ocean gives, and the ocean takes, and it answers to no man's rules. I am what people call a third-generation fisherman, and for over 2 decades now, I have captained vessels in the treacherous, unforgiving waters of the Bering Sea. Life as a commercial fisherman in Alaska isn't a career. It's a brutal calling. It takes everything from you, your body, your mind, and sometimes even your soul. We contend with bone-shattering cold that gnaws at your skin until it feels like it will splinter, waves that rise like watery giants intent on swallowing vessels whole, and storms that rage with a fury that makes you feel like an intruder trespassing in a domain that was never yours to begin with. Every season, good men vanish into the black water, their bodies never recovered, leaving only grieving families staring out across endless horizons with no answers. Yet for all the danger, there's a thrill in every successful haul, in the camaraderie of men who understand what it means to gamble their lives with every voyage, and in that deep, almost spiritual connection to the sea, a connection that has sustained my family for 3 generations. Fishing isn't just work. It brands itself onto your bones until the ocean becomes a part of your very existence. I've stood on decks coated in frozen seawater, where one slip could mean an instant plunge into death. I've fought towering walls of water that loomed like liquid mountains over my ship, threatening to crush everything I commanded. I've wrestled with engines that coughed and died in the middle of storms, braved frostbite that turned skin numb and black, and endured the psychological torment of months at sea with no sign of land, surrounded only by grey sky and darker sea. And yet none of those battles prepared me for what awaited us during one fateful voyage last October. It began as any ordinary expedition. My crew of 10 seasoned men and I set out from Dutch Harbour under a crisp, deceptively calm autumn morning. Our ship was packed with everything we'd need for 3 long weeks: heavy-duty gear, provisions, fuel, and the hopes of filling our holds with king crab and pollock from the fruitful waters of the Bering. There was laughter that morning, men in good spirits as gulls circled overhead, and the Arctic sun broke over the waves, casting the water in dazzling sparkles. For a time, the world felt alive and generous. But the sea has a cruel sense of humor, and its generosity often comes at a price. Hours after clearing the safety of the harbor, the weather began to shift. The waves grew restless, slapping harder against our hull. The horizon dimmed under the advance of a creeping fog that rolled in thick and unrelenting from the west. The air itself changed, heavier, almost oppressive. I could feel it press against my lungs as though warning me of something I couldn't yet name. My first mate, Antonio Ramirez, 15 years at sea and a man whose humor usually cut through even the darkest squalls, tried to lighten the mood, muttering about how the ocean always gave us the calm before the inevitable storm. His smile faltered when he saw my expression. Even Antonio could feel the tension tightening around us though, and he tried to mask it. By the time we reached the fishing grounds, nearly 60 miles from the nearest hint of land, the fog was absolute. A dense, ghostly wall smothered the horizon, so thick it felt like we were sailing inside a tomb. The wind screamed through our rigging like voices in torment, and the boat groaned under the weight of waves battering against its sides. But the men worked as they always did, with the quiet precision of men who had seen this before, who had faced death countless times and laughed in its face. Nets were lowered, catches hauled, boots thundered across slick decks as water crashed over railings. It was work, as brutal as it was routine, until the sea offered us something none of us had ever seen. The net came up heavier than usual, straining our equipment as the men cursed and pulled with everything they had. When the mass thudded onto the deck, it wasn't crab or fish that held our attention. Tangled among the catch was a carcass, a monstrous body that defied every natural law we knew. The thing sprawled across the slick wood, easily 10 feet from snout to tail, its skin covered in overlapping scales that shimmered like oil-slicked stone. Its limbs ended in gnarled claws capable of rending steel, and its skull was elongated, the jaws crammed with rows upon rows of serrated teeth, built not just for killing, but for crushing bone and shell alike. But what froze every man in place were the eyes. Even clouded in death, those eyes gleamed with something almost human. Intelligence. Malevolence. The deck fell silent. The usual banter and cursing died on our lips as we circled the body like men staring at a nightmare dragged into daylight. Speculation burst out in nervous voices. Had we unearthed some prehistoric monster, frozen in the depths since the dawn of time? Or was this an unknown predator rising from trenches where no light had ever reached? Theories piled up, but not one of them made sense. Our nets had pulled up more than flesh. Entangled in the carcass were objects, man-made, or at least something made by hands or claws, capable of shaping. The artifacts glistened wet beneath the deck lights. They were humanoid in shape, crudely but intentionally formed. Barnacles, coral, and the scars of centuries covered their surfaces, but beneath the growth were carvings, intricate markings, symbols glowing faintly with a strange luminescence. The men stepped back, whispering in unease. It wasn't just art or decoration. The symbols seemed to pulse, like a language trying to speak itself through light. None of us understood it, yet some deep, primal part of our brains recoiled from it, warning us not to stare too long. From that moment, unease settled over the ship like a suffocating shroud. The sea, once familiar, felt alien and hostile. Radio chatter with nearby vessels turned strange. Captains whispered of failing equipment, of crews vanishing mid-shift, of lights flickering beneath the water like signals from something alive down there. Tales of ghost ships drifting empty spread like wildfire through our tight-knit community of fishermen. Words like cursed and ancient began slipping into conversations where once we'd only spoken of weather and quotas. We weren't immune. On the 5th night, as the sea threw 40-foot waves at us, a wall of water crashed across our deck. Amidst the roar, we heard them. Voices. A chorus of whispers rising from the fog, speaking in tongues that clawed at our sanity. Some men swore they heard distinct voices, chanting in patterns that hypnotized as much as they terrified. Others swore they saw lights flickering beneath the waves, glowing in rhythm with the chants. When I ordered a sweep of the decks, desperate for answers, we found nothing but the sound of the sea. The sickness began after that. First, sleeplessness. Men tossing in their bunks, eyes wide with terror from dreams they couldn't describe. Then the shadows. Reports of figures pacing outside portholes, watching, waiting. Discipline unraveled fast. Men who had once obeyed without question began defying orders. Fights broke out in the confined quarters. Then came the vanishings. Crew members gone for hours, returning with hollow eyes and whispers in languages none of us knew. Their movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like puppets tugged by invisible strings. The ship itself turned against us. Compasses spun endlessly. GPS coordinates mapped us into impossible locations, and engines screamed as though alive before dying into silence, leaving us adrift in black water. I could feel something tightening its grip on us, something patient and cruel, waiting for us to break. The breaking point came with the storm. It was unlike any tempest I had ever seen. Lightning tore the sky into fragments, waves towered higher than any mountain, and as alarms blared, I left the bridge to investigate a crash below deck. What I found nearly ended me. The net storage room had transformed. The walls were smeared with a black, oily substance that writhed and pulsed like it was breathing. The stuff spread across surfaces, swallowing metal and wood alike, glowing faintly with sickly green patches of light. Before I could retreat, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in darkness. A growl rumbled through the hull, shaking my bones. Then the shadows began to form. Figures peeled themselves from the darkness, half human, half sea beast, their bodies scaled and rotting, their claws dripping, their eyes burning with hunger, older than mankind. Paralyzed, I nearly gave in to the terror, but desperation drove me to hurl myself against the door until it gave way, letting me escape into the chow was above. The ship was breaking apart. Alarms screamed, the deck tilted under monstrous waves, and the black substance spread like fire, consuming everything. Flames erupted, smoke choked the air, and men screamed as they were pulled into the darkness, their bodies convulsing before disappearing entirely. I watched friends I'd sailed with for years vanish into something no words could describe. When dawn came, the sea was unnaturally still. The fog lifted, revealing nothing but endless grey horizons. Our ship was scarred, broken, but still afloat. Only a handful of us remained. We drifted 3 days before rescue found us, and by then we were ruined men. Bodies weakened, minds shattered, souls burdened with knowledge that the Sea Guard's horrors far older than any human dream. I filed the official report with the Coast Guard. Equipment failure, catastrophic storm, crew lost to the sea. But the truth, the real truth, I share only in whispers. Something ancient waits beneath the frozen waters of the Bering. Something vengeful, something patient. I still fish because it's all I know, but I will never return to those grounds. I warn any man who will listen. Some catches should remain in the depths, rotting in darkness where they belong, because the sea does not forget, and it does not forgive. My name is Elena Vargas, and I'm 34 years old. 2 years ago, I was working as a maintenance technician on one of the oil platforms in Prudhoe Bay. It was my first winter assignment in Alaska, and I thought I was prepared for the isolation and the endless darkness. I had spent 6 years on offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, so I understood the rhythm of industrial operations and the challenges of living in a confined space with the same group of people for weeks at a time. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what unfolded during those 3 months on the ice platform. The North Star platform was a massive structure built on artificial islands, connected to the mainland by ice roads that were only passable during the coldest months. During winter operations, we maintained a crew of around 40 people working rotating 12-hour shifts to keep the drilling and extraction equipment operational around the clock. The platform was essentially a small industrial city sitting on frozen ground, surrounded by hundreds of miles of Arctic tundra that looked identical in every direction. When I arrived in early December, the sun had already set for the winter and wouldn't rise again until late January. We lived and worked entirely under artificial lighting. The crew was split into day and night shifts, and I was assigned to nights because of my maintenance experience. Night shift ran from 7 o'clock p.m. to 7 o'clock a.m., and our job was to handle equipment failures, perform routine maintenance, and keep life support systems running. It was demanding work, but I enjoyed the technical challenges and the fact that night shift usually had fewer supervisors and less bureaucratic interference. Our team was smaller, about 15 people compared to 25 on day shift. The first month went smoothly. The night shift crew was experienced and professional. There was Jake, the drill supervisor, who had spent 12 years on Arctic platforms. Sarah handled communications and monitored computer systems. Tommy and Marcus ran the power plant. We had a medic named David, a cook named Patricia keeping coffee and food flowing, and several other technicians and operators who knew their jobs inside out. We developed a rhythm, and despite the darkness and harsh conditions, morale was good. The problem began in early January, right around when the sun should have started returning but hadn't yet. I noticed subtle changes in the night shift workers. People wouldn't respond when spoken to, stared off into space, or gave answers that didn't quite fit the questions. I thought it was seasonal depression or cabin fever. Weeks in total darkness can affect anyone. But the behavior became more pronounced and coordinated. During shift briefings, Jake, Sarah, and Tommy would finish each other's sentences too precisely to be coincidence. They nodded simultaneously, laughed at the same moments, and sometimes all three would stare at something I couldn't see. When asked directly, they appeared confused, claiming they hadn't noticed anything. But I was observing closely, and their movements became increasingly synchronized. By mid-January, nearly half the night shift crew was acting this way. They moved through routines with mechanical precision, rarely speaking, responses brief and vacant. During breaks, they stood silently in small groups, communicating through glances and gestures. When the day shift relieved us, the affected members returned to normal, chatting as if nothing had happened. The most unsettling part, they were becoming more efficient. Equipment problems that normally took hours were resolved in minutes. Tasks requiring multiple people were handled by individuals in half the usual time. Night shift operations ran smoother than day shift ever had, and production number exceeded expectations. Management was thrilled, but I was terrified. I began staying awake during off hours to observe. What I discovered shook me. Between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m., affected crew gathered in lower platform areas normally restricted to essential personnel. They formed perfect circles, completely motionless for hours. I followed once, staying hidden, watching from a maintenance corridor as 12 people stood in one pump room. Eyes open, fully aware, yet utterly still, not sleeping, not meditating. The strangest part was the sound, or lack thereof. These rooms normally buzzed with machinery, fans, and hydraulic pumps. But when the crew gathered, all noise seemed dampened, creating an unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. I attempted to document it on camera, but images never captured the reality. Footage showed empty rooms with only normal equipment operation. Even standing right in front of the camera, they were invisible in recordings. Doubt crept in. Was I imagining this? But the crew's changes became undeniable. They moved with perfect coordination, anticipating each other, completing complex tasks without verbal communication. During emergencies, they acted as a single unit, flawless, unerring, unaffected by fatigue, frustration, or normal human limitations. The breaking point came in my 8th week. Alone in a generator room, the lights went out. This was typical for extreme weather, but what followed was beyond normal experience. In darkness, I heard the night shift moving, but not stumbling or using flashlights. Their movements were fluid, precise, like daylight operations. Their footsteps were perfectly synchronized, yet too many for the number of people I knew were present. Sounds came from multiple levels simultaneously. When emergency lighting returned 15 minutes later, major equipment had been serviced and repaired, work that should have taken hours with detailed manuals. I realized then they didn't need light, comms, unication, or instruction manuals to perform tasks. Whatever had changed them was beyond human capability. I requested an immediate transfer, claiming a family emergency, and left Alaska 3 days later. Official records indicate successful completion of my contract with positive reviews. Information on Arctic oil operations is tightly controlled. The platform's subsequent performance remains largely classified. I do know North Star continued exceeding production targets that winter, and several crew members received commendations. But at least 3 individuals from that assignment have since vanished entirely. No forwarding addresses, employment records, or social media presence. I now work on shore in refineries and chemical plants, where I return to my own bed nightly, and sunlight reaches me at least part of the day. Yet sometimes, in the darkest winter nights, I notice myself moving through routines with the same mechanical precision I witnessed on that platform. My mind sharpens, tasks complete themselves effortlessly. During these episodes, I feel connected to something vast and purposeful, extending beyond individual human consciousness. And a part of me, the part that endured those 3 months in Arctic darkness, knows whatever changed those night shift workers is still out there, still operating where civilization meets the endless cold, still recruiting new members for purposes I cannot begin to fathom. My name is Daniel Cross, though most people who know me just call me Hawk. I have been flying bush planes across the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska for nearly 13 years now, and I can honestly say there isn't a ridge, valley, or remote landing strip in this state I haven't navigated more times than I can count. For me, flying isn't simply a profession, it's the very center of my life. The one thing I've ever been truly great at, the pulse that drives me forward. When you spend your days piloting a small aircraft over jagged mountains, endless tundra and frozen lakes, through sudden storms that could swallow you whole, you learn very quickly that instinct and experience mean the difference between life and death. Up here, the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't give second chances. It waits patiently, ready to claim those who underestimate it. I learned to fly when I was barely 16, taught by my uncle who owned a modest charter business out of Anchorage. He drilled into me that in Alaska, pilots are not just drivers of machines, we are lifelines. We deliver food and medicine to villages cut off from roads. We evacuate the injured when disasters strike. We ferry scientists, hunters, fishermen, and tourists into places that the modern world hasn't touched. Sometimes we are the only fragile link between civilization and the endless emptiness that defines this land. In more than a decade, I've flown emergency rescues, supply drops, sightseeing tours, and research missions into places where no other pilot wanted to risk their wings. My reputation became solid, reliable, steady hands, someone you could count on to get you there no matter how bad the weather or how impossible the terrain. I was proud of that. Proud of the spotless safety record, the confidence my clients had in me, and the way my Cessna 185, my pride and joy, always answered my commands, like it was an extension of my own body. But last September, that confidence was shattered. The wilderness revealed something to me that no charts or training manuals could ever prepare a man for. It happened on what should have been nothing more than a routine charter job, the kind of flight I had performed dozens of times without incident. My booking agent called me early one Tuesday morning. A family of 4, the Parkers, needed transport to a remote fishing lodge about 200 miles northeast of Fairbanks. David and Elaine were in their mid-40s, cheerful and polite, bringing along their kids. Josh, 16, lanky and curious, and Emily, 14, bright-eyed and restless. They seemed like typical tourists, excited for an adventure, snapping pictures even before we boarded, asking me about bears, moose, and how cold it really got once winter rolled in. The forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild winds, smooth air. My Cessna was in top condition, freshly serviced 2 weeks earlier. The route was one I knew as well as the lines on my palm. We were scheduled to leave at 10:30 a.m. with an expected flight time of just under 2 hours. I had every reason to believe this would be as straightforward as they come. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The parks were thrilled, pointing out shimmering lakes, snow-capped ridges, and vast forests unfolding below us. I felt that familiar rhythm settle in, the peaceful hum of the engine, the steady compass, the occasional crackle of radio chatter. But then, small things started to feel off. At first, I thought it was my eyes. The mountain peaks looked just slightly misaligned compared to what I expected. A lake that should have been oval-shaped seemed more stretched, distorted. A river I knew well curved in the wrong direction. Tiny, subtle details, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. I told myself it was fatigue, maybe strange light playing tricks on my eyes. My instruments were fine, the compass steady, GPS readings consistent, engine humming like a song. Everything said we were right on course. Still, as the minutes passed, the landscape below grew stranger. Familiar landmarks no longer matched the maps in my head. Rivers flowed uphill against logic. Lakes blinked out of existence, replaced by empty patches of tundra. I gripped the yoke tighter, forcing calm, refusing to let unease creep into my voice when I glanced back at my passengers. That's when the real horror began. Elaine, the mother, who had looked like any healthy woman in her 40s when we left Fairbanks, suddenly seemed older. At first I thought it was the light slanting oddly across her face. But no, the grey in her hair had deepened, spreading like frost. Fine lines traced around her eyes, faint but definitely there. I turned my gaze to David. His hairline had receded further than I remembered, and his jawline sagged with subtle age. Then I noticed the kids. Josh seemed taller, his shoulders broader, his voice carrying a deeper tone when he spoke to his sister. And Emily. She no longer looked like a young teen. Her features had sharpened into those of a girl on the cusp of adulthood. My stomach turned cold. I blinked hard, hoping it was some trick of fatigue, but every time I looked back, they seemed older. Decades of change unfolding before my eyes in the span of minutes. Yet they didn't notice. They laughed. They pointed at the world outside as if nothing was wrong, oblivious to the impossible transformation happening to their own bodies. I checked the clock. By all accounts, we should have arrived 30 minutes ago. But below us stretched the same endless wilderness, repeating itself like a broken reel of film. Mountains, lakes, valleys, all eerily familiar, yet shifted. Warp. Ede, no lodge, no landing strip, no sign of human presence at all. I grabbed the radio, trying to hail Fairbanks, trying every frequency I knew, but all I got was static. A hissing wall of sound that filled the cabin no matter how I tuned it. By the second hour past our supposed arrival time, the Parkers had aged beyond recognition. Elaine's hair was pure white now, her face a map of wrinkles. David hunched in his seat, his hands trembling slightly when he reached for her. Josh's voice carried the depth of a grown man, his face lined with maturity. Emily. She looked like a woman in her 30s. Her eyes no longer the bright spark of youth, but steady, older, wiser. And still, they chatted like children on vacation, as if time had not touched them at all. They reminisced about moments that hadn't happened yet, conversations about birthdays and weddings and grandchildren, their voices casual and cheerful, while the years melted away inside the span of our impossible flight. I stared into the small mirror near my panel, half dreading what I'd see. But my reflection was unchanged. My eyes, my skin, everything the same as it had been when we left. Whatever this force was, it spared me. Why? I had no answer. My instruments insisted time was passing normally, the fuel gauge impossible in its steadiness despite the endless hours ticking by. I twisted the yoke, banking hard, changing heading after heading, but it didn't matter. The terrain remained the same, a frozen loop, an endless prison of distorted mountains and rivers. By what should have been late afternoon, the Parkers were ancient. David's skin sagged, his voice raspy with age. Elaine looked fragile, bones jutting under paper-thin skin. Josh and Emily were middle-aged, streaks of grey touching their hair. I felt trapped in a nightmare where my passengers lived entire lifetimes in the space of a single flight. And yet not one of them realized. They talked about plans for dinner at the lodge, asked how much longer until we arrived, smiled at the landscape below. Just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Without warning, the world snapped back into place. One moment, the warped wilderness stretched endlessly beneath us, the Parkers withered by decades. The next, there it was. The familiar landmarks, the fishing lodge, the thin strip of land that served as its runway. Relief nearly knocked the breath from me. My heart pounded as I prepared the descent. I turned back, needing to see them, needing to know. And there they were. Exactly as they had been that morning, David, strong and middle-aged, Elaine, laughing, the faintest hint of grey in her hair, Josh and Emily, just teenagers again, bright and curious. No wrinkles, no age, no memory of the nightmare I had witnessed. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to land, completely unaware that they had lived entire lifetimes within the confines of that impossible loop. I landed smoothly, though my hands trembled. The Parkers disembarked cheerfully, thanking me for what they described as an easy and uneventful flight. They gathered their bags, walked toward the lodge, and never once betrayed a hint that they remembered what had transpired in the sky. For them, nothing had happened. For me, it was as if I had watched them age, wither, and die, only for time to rewind without explanation. I never wrote this in any logbook, never reported it. What could I say? That time bent its sail, into knots above the Alaskan wilderness, that passengers lived decades in hours without knowing it. No one would believe me. I would be laughed out of the skies, my reputation destroyed. Yet I could not ignore what I had seen. I started asking quiet questions. I reached out to other bush pilots, men who had been flying these skies as long as I had. Slowly, carefully, I learned I wasn't alone. Others had stories, flights that lasted days when they should have lasted hours, landscapes that looped endlessly, passengers who swore nothing was wrong while impossible things unfolded around them. I still fly. I don't know how to stop. This is my life, my calling, and the wilderness doesn't let go once it has its hooks in you. But now, every time I step into the cockpit, every time the engine roars to life, I find myself watching the skies for signs that reality is bending again. Watching the horizon for landscapes that don't quite match. Watching my passengers for wrinkles that weren't there before. The Alaskan wilderness holds secrets we are not meant to understand. And some destinations don't exist on any map made by human hands. My name is Emery, and I've spent over 18 years as a surveyor with the USGS, mapping some of the most remote and challenging wilderness areas in North America. I have worked in the Rockies, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada, but nothing I experienced in those ranges prepared me for what I encountered in Alaska's Brooks Range. That region is a place where maps end and the unknown begins, where the landscape seems to resist human understanding, and where the very concept of geography becomes fluid and unreliable. I have dedicated my life to precision, to reading the contours of the earth and translating them into maps that people trust. But there, everything I knew failed me. In July of 2020, I was assigned what was supposed to be a routine solo mapping expedition. The USGS had identified a section of the northern Brooks Range where existing survey data, much of it from the 1950s, was incomplete or inconsistent with modern satellite imagery. My task was straightforward. Conduct a ground survey to verify the topography, record GPS waypoints, and confirm the accuracy of elevation data for peaks, valleys, streams, and glaciers. It was the kind of work I had done dozens of times before. I packed my equipment, checked my supplies for the 10th time, and flew into the region via a small bush plane, landing on a gravel bar along a braided river that would serve as my base camp. The pilot warned me that the weather could change in an instant and that radio communications might be unreliable. He promised to return in 10 days to extract me, weather permitting. I watched the plane disappear over the jagged horizon, feeling that familiar mixture of exhilaration and isolation that comes with venturing into truly wild country. For the first 2 days, everything seemed normal. The terrain was stunning: jagged peaks, pristine alpine lakes reflecting the sky, vast expanses of tundra stretching endlessly. Caribou grazed in the valleys, ptarmigans fluttered among the rocks, and dull sheep cautiously observed me from a distance. I established survey routes, recorded GPS readings at regular intervals, and photographed notable landmarks. My equipment worked flawlessly. The weather remained stable. I began to build a precise understanding of the terrain. But on the third morning, everything changed. I attempted to return to a reference point I had established the day before, a distinctive rock formation I had photographed and noted as a critical survey marker. According to my GPS, I should have reached it within 2 hours, yet after nearly 4 hours of hiking, the terrain around me did not match my previous observations. Where there had been a rugged outcrop, I now faced a deep, narrow valley I had never seen. My GPS insisted I was in the correct coordinates, but my eyes told me otherwise. At first I thought it was a navigation error or a temporary malfunction. I double-checked the readings, switched to my backup GPS unit, and recalibrated the compass. Both devices indicated that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Yet the landscape around me had been rearranged overnight. Rocks, valleys, and slopes seemed to have shifted in ways that made no sense. I stared in disbelief, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the next several hours, I tried to regain my bearings by heading toward other known landmarks. But no matter which route I took, I kept returning to a peculiar circular clearing surrounded by stunted spruce trees. I could not recall seeing it in my initial survey. The clearing became a constant point of disorientation, a place I entered, left, and somehow re-entered, despite taking different paths. I began to realize that the physical landscape was not stable. Peaks and valleys seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The very ground beneath me refused to obey logic. By the 5th day, I was physically and mentally exhausted. My sleep was restless, haunted by dreams of landscapes folding back on themselves, rivers flowing uphill, and peaks growing impossibly high before collapsing into valleys below. I marked distinctive outcrops and used them to navigate, only to find hours later that they had moved or vanished entirely. My GPS began showing impossible readings, coordinates placing me hundreds of miles from my location, or sometimes seemingly in the Arctic Ocean. The topographic software on my laptop, which had always been reliable, now displayed patterns that defied comprehension. Mountains forming perfect geometric shapes, lakes appearing where no depression existed, and ridges looping back upon themselves. Reality had become fluid, and the familiar certainties of surveying were gone. I began documenting everything meticulously. Coordinates, timestamps, compass bearings, environmental conditions, every detail that could provide a record of the anomalies. I kept detailed sketches of shifting rock formations, photos of landmarks, and logs of impossible topographic data. Sleep became brief and shallow. Every time I rested in my tent, I dreamt of mountaintops collapsing into valleys and rivers, defying gravity. I would wake up convinced my tent had moved overnight. On several occasions, I discovered that my equipment, GPS units, survey markers, even cached supplies, had been rearranged in ways I could not explain. Despite careful anchoring and markings, objects appeared in different positions each morning. On the 7th day, the anomaly escalated further. Attempting to climb a ridge for a clear view of the surrounding area, I reached what I assumed was the summit. From there, I saw a valley below that I had hiked through earlier that morning. The GPS showed I was standing at over 8,000 feet, while the valley beneath read nearly 9,000 feet. I was on a mountain that was lower than the valley I had already traversed. I attempted to descend into this impossible valley, only to find myself climbing uphill despite visual evidence indicating I was moving downhill. My understanding of geography had been shattered. The terrain was no longer fixed. Gravity, elevation, and spatial orientation had become unreliable concepts. Accepting the impossibility allowed me to focus on survival. I began to notice patterns. Certain landmarks, though unstable, recurred in loops. Paths that seemed circular could be used to estimate the edges of the anomalous zones. I mapped these safe zones where the landscape seemed temporarily consistent. Timing also mattered. Early mornings intensified the effects, while midday brought slight stability. By methodically observing, testing, and moving, I navigated toward what I hoped was the boundary of the anomaly. The process took 3 days of painstaking observation and trial and error. Each day, the Brooks Range revealed new impossibilities. I watched rivers reverse direction mid-flow, glaciers appear to move sideways, and hills fold in upon themselves like sheets of paper. Animals behaved oddly too. Caribou would vanish from a valley as I approached, only to reappear unchanged elsewhere. The wildlife, though real, seemed to ignore the shifting geography entirely. The paradoxical environment made me question not only my perceptions, but the laws of physics themselves. Finally, on the 10th day, I heard the sound of a plane approaching from the south. Using my emergency radio, I contacted the pilot and guided him to a gravel landing site near my original base camp. As I approached the site, I was stunned to find it appeared exactly as it had 10 days earlier, the gravel bar unchanged, the river's course unaltered, and the landmarks in their expected positions. My caches were untouched. Head and the GPS readings were normal for the first time in a week. It was as if the impossible terrain had receded entirely, leaving only the familiar landscape I had known before the expedition. During the flight out, I attempted to explain my experiences to the pilot. He was polite but skeptical, suggesting isolation, altitude, and stress may have affected my judgment. I submitted my official report to the USGS, including only conventional topographic data from the first 2 days, which matched existing survey maps. To any reviewer, it seemed a routine and successful mapping mission. But I kept my personal notes. They document every disorienting, impossible observation. GPS readings contradicting visual evidence, valleys folding backward, rivers reversing, peaks appearing and vanishing, compasses spinning, and night-long loops back to the same locations. These notes are detailed, precise, and consistent. I am not hallucinating, nor were these simple mistakes. I have been trained to observe, measure, and verify, and yet here was a place that defied all such rules. Since that expedition, I have not returned to Alaska. I transferred to urban surveying projects, mapping roads and infrastructure where the environment remains stable and measurable. But I still think of the Brooks Range frequently. Sometimes while reviewing GPS data or topographic maps late at night, I remember standing on a mountaintop, looking down into a valley at a higher elevation. I remember the terror, the awe, and the realization that the earth can be stranger than any human understanding. There are places in the world where the normal relationship between position and landscape breaks down, where skilled navigators become lost despite perfect instruments, where reality itself shifts in ways we cannot yet measure. The Brooks Range holds secrets far beyond mineral deposits or wildlife counts. In its remote peaks and valleys lie zones where the very structure of space is altered, where skilled surveyors like myself can become hopelessly lost, where geometry and geography are mutable. I documented one small piece of this phenomenon, but I am convinced it extends far beyond the areas I traversed, threading through Alaska's wilderness in ways that hint at a logic and intelligence we have yet to comprehend. Even now, I wonder if anyone else will ever stumble upon these anomalies, or if the Brooks Range will keep its secrets hidden forever. A reminder that the Earth still holds mysteries beyond human understanding. My name is Aaron Tallick, and I've been guiding people through Alaska's wilderness for over 2 decades. I'm a native Yukon, and I grew up listening to my grandfather's stories, tales of things that live deep in the forests and mountains, things that most people dismiss as folklore, but that our people have always known were real. He taught me to read the land, how to track animals, interpret the wind and the snow, recognize when something is out of place. He also warned me that there are areas in Alaska where even the most experienced hunters shouldn't go, and creatures that are better left undisturbed. I thought I understood what he meant, until August 2021. That summer, I was hired to guide a family from Oregon on a 5-day backcountry hiking trip in Denali National Park. The Hendersons were not the typical tourists I usually guided. The father had climbed mountains across the western United States. The mother was a seasoned wilderness survival instructor, and their 2 teenage sons had been backpacking since they were children. They specifically requested a route that would take them off the beaten path, away from established trails, into areas where they were unlikely to encounter anyone else. They wanted an authentic wilderness experience, and I believed I could provide that safely. We started near the Teclanica River, planning to hike northeast into the foothills below Mount McKinley. My route followed old caribou trails and abandoned mining tracks, paths rarely seen by anyone outside the park service. The tundra was alive that late summer, a mixture of browns, greens and golds, with pockets of alderbrush and scattered boulders. Streams cut through the valley like silver ribbons, reflecting the pale sun that lingered low on the horizon. Wildlife activity was high. Caribou herds were moving across the foothills. Bears were roaming for late-season berries, and I hoped we might even glimpse a wolf pack. The mosquitoes were relentless, but we were prepared. The first 2 days passed smoothly. The Hendersons moved well over challenging terrain. The teenagers navigated scree slopes and brush-filled ridges with energy and enthusiasm. We stopped often to admire the view, to point out distant dhole sheep along the ridgelines, and to study animal tracks. I taught the family how to identify signs of wildlife: scat, broken branches, fur caught on bark. Everything felt routine. It was on the second day, after we stopped for lunch near a small stream, that I noticed something unusual. At first glance, the tracks looked like wolf prints, but they were much too large, 8 inches long and 6 inches wide, with claws extending unnaturally far from the toes. The impressions suggested an animal far heavier than even the largest Alaskan wolf, maybe 280 pounds or more. The stride length was wrong as well. The print suggested long, powerful legs, unlike anything I had seen in over 20 years of guiding. The tracks were fresh. The mud was soft and still slightly wet. The impressions had been made only hours before. My stomach tightened, but I didn't alarm the Hendersons. I kept a closer watch, observing the surrounding forest for signs of movement. As we hiked, I noticed more anomalies. Trees had deep scratches far higher than any known predator could reach, as if something enormous had marked them. Scat contained fragments of bone far too large for wolves to hunt. A musky scent hung in the air, something thick and primal that didn't belong in the normal wilderness. My pulse quickened. Whatever had been in this area was unlike anything I had ever encountered. That evening we camped in a sheltered valley. The site offered visibility in all directions and access to fresh water. I positioned my tent strategically, rifle within arm's reach, and kept a watchful eye on the surrounding terrain. The family settled in, tired but content. The first night was quiet, but as midnight approached, a sound rose from the darkness that froze my blood. It was howling, but not like any wolf or dog I had ever heard. The sound was deeper, resonant, almost musical, and seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. The howls would start low, swell to a piercing crescendo, then fade, only to begin again from a different location. The Hendersons woke in alarm. The father whispered, "Wolves?" I shook my head. "No," I said, though I wasn't certain myself. The calls were wrong, too intelligent, too deliberate. Wolves howl to communicate with a pack, but these calls seemed like signals, challenges, or warnings. They were approaching, systematically circling our camp. I shined my flashlight toward the forest edges, but the darkness swallowed everything. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing. The boys whispered questions I couldn't answer. My mind raced. Each howl seemed closer than the last. Hours passed with no sleep. At first light, I found tracks encircling our campsite, the same oversized prints. Whatever had been out there had walked within 30 feet of our tents, stopping at intervals as if studying us. I felt their gaze, a presence more tangible than any animal I had ever tracked. The family's safety became my obsession. I decided to alter our route, heading toward more populated areas. The following day was tense. Fresh tracks appeared along our trail, always slightly ahead, as if monitoring us. Movement flickered in the trees and behind rocks, but whenever I looked directly, not Hing was there. My anxiety grew with each step. The Hendersons were brave, but their unease was palpable. The boys kept glancing behind. The mother kept muttering about the strangeness of the sounds and shadows. I kept my rifle ready, my senses hyper-aware. On the third afternoon, we crested a ridge and saw what I can only describe as a nightmare made real. Spread across a 2-acre valley below were the remains of a caribou herd. But these were no ordinary predator kills. The animals had been torn apart with brutal precision. Legs and heads were removed and arranged in patterns. Internal organs had been carefully removed from some carcasses. Blood was fresh, overpowering the senses, yet not a single scavenger. No birds, no foxes, not even insects, dared enter the area. The meticulous destruction suggested intelligence, purpose, and immense strength. I counted at least 40 caribou, almost an entire herd. The sheer scope of the slaughter was staggering. Hunger could not explain it. The systematic arrangement and selective removal of parts indicated something calculating, something ancient and intelligent. It was not wolves, bears, or any known predator. This was something else entirely. We immediately retreated, abandoning our campsite and hiking until dark to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that valley. I called for an emergency helicopter pickup, citing altitude sickness for the ruse. The helicopter arrived the next morning, 15 miles from the kill site, extracting us from the wilderness. I reported the caribou deaths to the Park Service. By the time rangers investigated, no evidence remained. The carcasses were gone, blood washed away by rain, and the ground showed no unusual activity. Officially, I had stumbled across an avalanche or landslide site cleaned by scavengers. I know better. My grandfather's stories spoke of the adlet, creatures that inhabit the deepest wilderness, neither fully animal nor human, hunting with intelligence and a purpose beyond comprehension. I realized that we had crossed into the territory of such beings, ancient predators who exist on the edge of the natural world and occasionally intersect with ours. Since that trip, I avoid Denali's backcountry. I still guide tourists, but only along established trails with other people nearby. I've learned the hard way that Alaska holds places where human understanding falters, where creatures hunt with a wisdom and ferocity beyond comprehension. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the echo of that howling in the wind, feel the gaze of something unseen, and wonder whether those adlet are still watching, waiting, and counting, those who dare wander too far into their domain.